8 out of 10 soldiers dead in the war were Russian, and Zhukov had over 1 million men only 30 miles east of Berlin. And Spring Awakening was supposed to be a revanche or resurrection of the British Operation Spring that had failed when Hitler survived the 20th of July plot. And for Spring Awakening, Himmler sent Sepp Dietrich and his refurbished 6th Panzer Division to Hungary to get ready for Monty's separate peace. Hungary was basically northern Yugoslavia and was a little smaller than Kentucky, and Sepp Dietrich was sent 200 miles north of Belgrade to prepare for the pushback against the Russians that would begin as Zhukov was steamrolling over Berlin, and that was supposed to horrify the Americans into turning against Russia. As soon as Hitler was certifiably dead at the hands of the Russians, the war would be over, and the new German government with its headquarters at Vienna could watch as Stalin's army was conquered and thrown out of Berlin, and Goering had been in Vienna preparing to strike up a partnership with the Americans. As British war planners huddled over their maps, Kim Philby stayed near his telephone, and the big question foremost in everyone's mind was, why weren't the Russians moving towards Berlin? Just as the Americans in southern Germany were reaching the Elbe at Torgau, Hitler was reading Carlyle's Frederick the Great over the radio, and a large part of Frederick the Great's success had been due to his encouragement of Jewish scholars allowed to participate in the government. These Jews had taught Arabic numbers and algebra to German students, and they'd counseled Frederick the Great to issue notes stamped on leather rather than using only gold coins for money. Himmler waited at Schneidemühl until the 13th of March and then took his train to Ravensbrück, where there was a big sanatorium a few miles away, and the sanatorium at Leichen had been used by the elite SS as their headquarters, and Ravensbrück was right outside Fürstenberg, where there was a busy airfield. A week later, on the 20th of March, Hitler had Gotthard Heinrichi relieve Himmler as commander of the Army of the Vistula, and Hitler told Gotthard that Himmler had stepped down for health reasons just in case word got out that Himmler had been at the Leichen sanatorium because the SS headquarters at Ravensbrück was something of a secret. Monty wanted to end up in Berlin in the last days of the war to sign his separate peace and join with the Germans to fight Russia, but first Monty needed to get to Berlin, and to get there he had to fool Patton, and Patton was nobody's fool. Monty cabled Ike on the 27th of March to say he would be marching in 2 days towards Berlin, but would set up his command post first in Hanover, and Monty reached Hanover on the 10th of April, where there was, quote, a suspicious concentration of SS divisions on the southern flanks, close quote. Bradley, page 523. The Elbe River cut through Europe at a 45-degree angle, starting in Czechoslovakia at the same latitude as Paris, and heading downstream northwest through Dresden and Torgau and Magdeburg, where it took a sharp turn to the north 60 miles away from Berlin, keeping northward for 60 miles until resuming its 45-degree angled northwest towards Hamburg, where it reached the North Sea 100 miles later. Ike's choice for the border in southern Germany between the Russians and the Americans was at Torgau on the Elbe River because it was a clear landmark that kept the danger of friendly fire down to a minimum, and Monty agreed to the Elbe because as it veered northwest towards the North Sea, the Elbe went right through Hanover, where Monty was heading, and Berlin was 150 miles due east of Hanover. If Eisenhower were to devise a safe plan for a juncture between the East and the West, he dared not defer it much longer, for any recommendation from Schaeff would have to be forwarded to the Kremlin. Like Eisenhower, I was unwilling to trust in prearranged recognition signals, even less in the use of radio contact with the Reds. Such signals were likely to be confused, and radio contact would be impaired by an impossible language barrier. It was partly this fear of running head-on into a single British division at Falaise that had induced me to halt Patton's forces at Argenton. Now, with almost 100 times as many forces spread from the North Sea to Switzerland, I shuddered at the prospect of a collision that might easily flare into a fight. Bradley, page 518 and 19. Although Churchill protested Eisenhower's radio to Moscow as an unwarranted intrusion by the military into a political problem, he reserved his angriest vituperation for the plan Eisenhower had proposed. The Prime Minister, according to Eisenhower, was, quote, greatly disappointed and disturbed, close quote, that Schaeff had not reinforced Montgomery with American troops and pointed him towards Berlin in a desperate effort to capture that city before the Russians took it. Bradley, page 521. Ike wrote to Stalin on March 28 that the Americans would not advance on Berlin, and Churchill hollered that Ike was not allowed to address another head of state, and Ike replied that he was speaking to Stalin as a fellow army commander rather than as a head of state. Churchill was hoping to scare the Americans about the oncoming Russians, but the first concentration camps were being overrun and the mood towards Germany had tightened, and Ike wasn't biting. Montgomery was reduced to mere flank support for the Ninth Army on its way to Leipzig, under American rather than British command, and that foreclosed Monty's drive to Berlin, while the British continued to object to Ike's authority and to his direct communication with the Russians. On the night of March 28, the BCOS chambers at Whitehall rang with indignation over Eisenhower's redundant demotion of Montgomery in the message and the surprise news of his plans to return to Bradley Simpson's Ninth Army, which he had intended, quote-unquote, to keep with Montgomery. In his diary, Brooke chronicled the anger in the BCOS over Eisenhower's plan, which Brooke called, quote-unquote, unintelligible, unauthorized, and a clear breach of promise in relegating Montgomery to a, quote-unquote, static mission. Eisenhower at War, page 741. Montgomery bitterly complained to Brooke about the loss of Simpson's Ninth Army, which would confine the 21st Army Group to a holding action. Churchill addressed a stream of messages to Eisenhower and Roosevelt to protest Montgomery's demotion and criticized for the record what he took to be Eisenhower's decision to foreclose Berlin as an Allied objective. Eisenhower at War, page 743. On the 3rd of April, Ike took the American Ninth Army out from under Montgomery's command, and the American 84th Infantry Division captured the capital city of Hanover, arriving just before Monty and staying there to keep an eye on the British. The last German illusions of stalemate and the prospects of negotiated peace had been crushed by the weight of our army and the impressive wealth of Allied equipment. Until the week we spanned the Rhine at Remagen, some of the enemy still clung to a last thin hope that the newly developed German jets might yet neutralize the Allied superiority in the air. Top priorities had been assigned the production of jet aircraft, and already the enemy was believed to have manufactured in underground plants between 600 and 800 of these fast interceptors. Even in March 1945, production was estimated at 200 jet aircraft per month. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe had issued recalls for trained airmen from the army, and at a half-dozen aerodromes, jet pilots were being trained. But like Hitler's V-weapons, the jets had come too late. Had von Rundstedt succeeded in stalemating the Allied ground advance in his Bulge attack, the enemy might then have exploited his jet advantage. But our armies swarmed over the Rhineland, encircled the Ruhr, and headed east. But as our armies swarmed over the Rhineland, encircled the Ruhr, and headed east, we overran his underground plants before those jets could join the battle. Bradley, page 518. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen had not been blown because the Germans were supposed to use it to come back into France after the negotiated separate peace, but the French First Army cut off the German retreat into Switzerland through the Swabian highlands, spoiling what was left of the British plan. After Ike took the Ninth Army away from Monty on the 4th of April and gave it back to Bradley, the Ninth Army reached the Elbe on the 11th of April near Magdeburg and crossed the river, while Monty was still 60 miles away, and the Russians had still not attacked the Seelow Heights, so the Americans and the Russians were roughly equidistant from Berlin. The day before, Patton had been warned on the 10th of April that some commandos were planning to sneak in and kill him, so he started carrying his carbine with him to bed. And on the 12th of April, the day FDR died, Ike and Bradley and Patton went to see a salt mine at Merkers outside Frankfurt, and Patton looked at the elevator cable and said, "If that clothesline should part, promotions in the U.S. Army would be considerably stimulated." In addition to 100 million in gold bullion, the MPs found 3 billion Reichsmarks, another 2 million in American greenbacks, together with lesser quantities of British, Norwegian, and French currency had been stacked in those dry salt chambers 2,100 feet below the ground. Bradley, page 527. Then they went to see the concentration camp at Ohrdruf that Patton had overrun several days before, and they visited the 1 million square foot underground Nordhausen rocket factory outside Frankfurt, where the Germans had been building the new V-2 rockets capable of obliterating several square miles per each rocket, and the first V-2 rocket had been tested in January, right before FDR had called the meeting at Yalta, and the Germans had been making 400 of them each month before abandoning the factory only 1 week before the Americans marched in. When Edward P. Murrow arrived in Buchenwald with Patton's Third Army on the 11th of April, he walked around the camp pressing $100 bills into the hands of walking skeletons. Money won in a poker game the night before, and on the 15th of April, Patton took the townsfolk on a tour of the Buchenwald camp, and that same day Ed Murrow broadcast the story from London to his CBS listeners. The news of FDR's death almost overwhelmed the news about the camps, but not quite. And Churchill's order that camp atrocity stories be censored as hindering the war effort no longer mattered, as the censors seemed to have lost their power, and the truth came out about the work camps and the slave labor that had been fueling Hitler's war. The reason that the bridge at Remagen had been so important was that supplies for the war were delivered primarily by railway, while prisoners were taken to the work camps on the return trip, and Remagen was a double-track rail line. The camps were all built as places where offenders could do useful labor for helping Germany, and they put up big signs at the entrances that said, "Work makes free," in order to welcome the new people. Inmates were told that contributing to Germany would be rewarded, and the processing centers were operating in every district with the utmost German efficiency. It was not seen as objectionable or unfair that guilt was being decided on the streets by the police, because they were supported by the majority of citizens, and it was believed that these cases would be settled in the camps when the offenders arrived from the processing centers. The camps used the same large barracks well known throughout Germany as workers' warehouses that the Kaiser had set up as a joint venture between the government and private businesses, places where a transient or displaced person could get regular meals and a clean bed, and everyone knew that Hitler himself had lived in one of these work hostels. The unemployed received what they needed to find work, and these working man shelters had a barber and a tailor and a doctor in residence, and these shelters, with the wooden barracks, had been around for decades, so it was assumed that the exact same protocol was being implemented in the camps now blossoming under National Socialism, where the needy were being concentrated or assembled and then gifted with jobs and real work. Homelessness had not been a problem in Germany since the Kaiser started these workhouses called Herbergen, and they even sold beer and cigars there at reduced price to the residents, and by the turn of the century there had been thousands of these working man barracks all across Germany, so Hitler simply expanded on an old idea, and what had worked for thousands would now work for millions. The camps were designed to fill the need for making community service work possible, and also to provide for the needy or the dispossessed, and these work centers run by the government in industrial centers were now simply extended to include the administration of justice, and the whole system was considered a good economical program for success. After 1936, the production of uniforms and war materials being made in the camps turned the arrangement into a thriving enterprise, and as the camps boomed, processing centers funneled ever more workers into the labor camps because too many of them had been dying in typhoid epidemics. The scythe of disease decimating the concentrations of prison workers was not addressed because the big moneymaker was in the initial arrest of prisoners, and Jews especially were, after all, dispensable, and as prisoners died, the demand for more workers called out for more arrests. Himmler had been appointed Germany's chief of police on April Fool's Day in 1933 and had called for a boycott of all Jewish businesses, but the boycott didn't work because Germans continued to do business with Jews, and so the Nazis needed to step up the brainwash propaganda against Jews using the newspapers and radio broadcasts and the movie industry. In less than 3 years of listening to these smears against the chosen people, spewed forth from the broadcast media, claiming to be in sync with the authority of the government, there were few of the master race who did not believe the propaganda to be true, and it came to pass that many good Germans began to think that the best thing that could happen for the Jews was for them all to become Christians. When too many Jews refused this kind offer, there would be hell to pay, and while some Jews had blended in with the Germans in an attempt to ameliorate Jew hatred, others kept to themselves in their own enclaves for self-protection from the Gentiles and their renewed campaign to blame Jews for having killed Christ. There were two kinds of Jews: those who thought a Jewish homeland in Palestine was a good idea, and those who thought that there should be no Jewish state at all until the Messiah returned to set up his Jewish state. The no-state Jews believed it was their religious duty to prepare the world for the coming of the Messiah by establishing governments run by Jews prepared to receive him, and when Messiah appeared, the worldwide Jewish government would remain in place, with the faithful continuing to serve in their positions of authority during the ensuing Messianic age. And to these Jews, anyone who wanted to migrate to Palestine was an absolute traitor to Judaism. The majority of Jews trusted God to care for them and did not believe in fighting back against the Nazis, holding that the definition of a good Jew was to be pleasant and accommodating, and on many occasions in the concentration camps, escape plans from within the ranks of Jewry were intentionally thwarted by other incarcerated Jews claiming to have a superior knowledge of the religion, and the vast majority, whether religious or not, maintained that Jews should not be soldiers but must leave military matters in the hands of the Gentiles. To disprove the point, the first German officer killed in the Great War had been Jewish, and beyond that the contradictions about God's people had just kept coming as Jews had learned to run from raging mobs, so they were called cowards, and they'd learned to do business with crippling restrictions, and so they were called sneaky. and they were only allowed to deal with money matters, so they were called greedy, and they were not allowed into Christian organizations, and so they were called secretive, and the trains full of people on their way to the camps were relatively quiet because they thought that things would go better for them if they didn't make trouble, and their ready compliance convinced everyone that the dirty Jew knew they finally had it coming.